Career modes in sim racing games have been a pretty hot topic lately. The new Forza Motorsport and Gran Turismo 7's careers have seen their fair share of criticism, and a lot of more hardcore sims usually just ignore the single-player experience entirely or slap together a pretty simple and forgettable chain of races. So it's easy to criticize these more lackluster campaigns, but harder to agree on what the better alternative is. Everyone's got a different take on what makes for a good sim racing career, and some don't even care for single player in sims at all. But today, I want to talk about why Gran Turismo 4's GT mode is, in my eyes, the best sim racing career mode in history, and why we might never see something like it again. Although there are obviously other games out there that have done pretty well some of the things I'll talk about in this video, I don't think that any game has executed three important things better than Gran Turismo 4. These three elements are progression, variety, and realism. Let's start with realism. I'm not talking about how real the physics are, but more about how believable the career is and how closely it could mimic a real driver's entire racing career. In GT4, this starts right away when purchasing your first used vehicle. Do you know anyone who got into cars by getting a brand new sports car right away? Sure, it happens, and some super wealthy prodigies can grow up karting and then end up buying a race car outright to start their career or something, but I think you all understand the point I'm trying to make here. The majority of car people are driving often older, used cars at the start of their driving career, and they're racing with those cars in track days, time trials, and local events. This is something that right away, I think so many games just skip over, and it's something that immediately attracted me to Gran Turismo. Now, GT7 does still have you pick up an economy hatchback as your first car, but these are modern, non-enthusiast cars, and I feel confident saying that the average car person would not want to go out and buy a 2014 Honda Fit Hybrid, because that same money could get you a used Porsche or an old muscle car, or even a much cooler Honda Fit. When I think of my experiences in the real world as a car guy, a lot of memorable moments come from searching out and buying used old sports cars. And this is what I loved about GT4. Your first car choice was believable. And I love that we had 3 different used car showrooms with sort of randomly rotating RNG car selection, because it meant that you were always checking around to see what was available. And it felt exciting to see a rare car show up one week. In real life, even though I do already have a fun car, I still regularly browse used car sites just to see what's out there. And it's fun to daydream about having more money and garage space to pick up those rare gems and think about how I could build or race them. I know I'm far from the only person who does this, and I just don't really know why mechanics like this aren't more common or expanded on in games today. The starter and early car experience is important. It's first impressions. And even more arcade titles are starting to move away from the low-class budget starter car onto more flashy and high-end modern models, which is a choice I can understand, but don't necessarily agree with. I do think there's a point to be made about games being a fantasy, and sure, being able to buy a brand new 80s sports car in 2023 is certainly something a lot of us wish we could do. But I think, in real life, used cars have character and a history, and I think to an extent that's something that could be translated through a video game to make the purchase of a vehicle more fun and meaningful, something to connect you more to the car and make the experience more real. And I do get that when buying a used car in GT4. Now, another thought is that maybe these game design decisions are now more influenced by automotive brands that want to promote their newer vehicles, or not show off their old models in a less than perfect state. Back in the early 2000s, licensing in games was less established. But as we've seen more today in modern racing, automakers can be extremely protective of their brand. and something like Ferrari not wanting to see their old rusty cars in game, or Toyota working a deal to get their newest model as one of the game's starter cars, are both entirely plausible scenarios. Maybe that's part of why used car mechanics don't really exist much in gaming anymore. But ultimately, to me, sim racing realism, especially in these console sims like Forza and Gran Turismo, doesn't need to be just about the physics or details on the track. It can be about mimicking that real car enthusiast experience, and buying used cars is often a big part of that. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, but this has always been a standout feature for me in Gran Turismo 4. And with that, I want to talk about pretty much the next big feature you'll encounter in GT after getting your first car: getting your license. I know, not everybody likes this system, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but I do love it. And I think the general concept of an in-game racing school is so useful for games like this. Not only is it a very powerful in-game tool to help drivers improve in a bite-sized format, it again mimics real life, where driving schools are a very common way for amateurs to dip their toes into racing. I think GT4's license system is a great way to introduce players to a variety of cars and teach the basics of racing and vehicle dynamics without just throwing you into a race right away. It does slow the pace, and I understand why some people don't love it as much as I do, but I think there are ways to improve the system without ditching it entirely. And it's worth shouting out that modern Gran Turismo still does this pretty well, and I was excited to see a rally school mode in WRC too. And a different take on the license system might be the iRacing license system, where through PvP, you have to work your way up into higher licenses that unlock more types of racing, which is a believable and somewhat realistic progression system. And so speaking of progression, let's talk about how you progress through Gran Turismo 4, which parallels a lot the conversation on realism. I think a good sim racing career involves believable, semi-linear progression, where you're starting at the bottom and earning your way to the top while working towards realistic and believable goals. You should start in some old crappy slow cars doing weekend track days or Sunday cups, while over time earning your way into higher car classes and more prestigious racing divisions. GT4 does a great job of this. You start with access to easier, casual beginner events with some fun, pretty standard theming, and then you work your way up to professional events where things get more serious and you start racing some real race cars and can compete in more major events. And then you can get into endurance racing, world tour stuff, and extreme events towards the end game. The pacing is steady and natural. You often can spend a good amount of time with your cars before moving on to something else. Each purchase is meaningful, and completing and progressing through events feels rewarding because it has meaning. Every step is getting you closer to something else that you want, whether it be an expensive car or just an upgrade or major event that you want to participate in. Now, of course, you can grind out some events to get lots of cash, but on a normal playthrough, you're always conscious of your cash flow and money needed to make that next big purchase or upgrade. And it never really feels like the game gives you too much or too little. You have the money you need to buy the cars you need to compete in the races you need to compete in. It's a gameplay loop that's paced really well, where you still have to make the same decisions towards the end of the game that you did right near the start. It's something that I really appreciate, because this can be hard to balance, and some games swing way too far in one direction or the other. Now, before I double layer these rose-tinted glasses, I should say that, yeah, GT4 was hard as hell, especially on your first playthrough, and it even felt unfair at times. I could sit here and say, oh well, a greater challenge sweetens the eventual victory. And sure, that's true, but I'm not trying to make a point here. Gran Turismo 4 was not easy for the average player to complete, and there is something to be said for a game that's more of a sandbox that allows players to experience the content more freely. For me though, I like the challenge and steady progression that Gran Turismo 4 provides. Now, let's talk about variety. I'm not just talking about the variety of cars and tracks and events, even though GT4 does have a lot of all of that. But what I mean by variety, and I know this opinion isn't shared by everyone, is that I enjoy racing games that aren't afraid to take a break from the racing. I think garage management, car building and maintenance, more unique driving challenges, and heck, even car photography are all important to a good sim racing career. Because again, it mimics what it's like to really race. In real life, it's not all racing. There's a build up to race day. There's planning and car maintenance and effort that goes into it. And then there's the big event, and then the payoff and the cool down. And then you get ready to plan for the next event. There's a flow there. You can kind of draw parallels to other genres here. Good RPGs or FPS games aren't all combat. They aren't all action all the time. There's an ebb and flow. There's build up, challenge, and then payoff and relief. When you have that good pacing, it makes those major events more meaningful. This is something that GT4 did really well with for a sim, and it's something many other racing games often struggle with. Managing your budget and car upgrades and maintenance, making informed decisions on what to compete in based on your available options, practicing for big events with some training, showing off your cars in photo shoots. So much of the car enthusiast experience takes place outside of the race. And I wish we'd see more innovation in this direction instead of just being railroaded from one race right into the next, all the way to the end of the game, where each individual event doesn't really have any unique meaning to it. Gran Turismo 4's events were memorable, often with big payoffs. And then there were also unique driving challenges and an incredible photo mode and some micromanagement gameplay with your car roster that all broke up the monotony of going from race to race. Of course, more arcade games like Horizon have a lot of non-racing gameplay, but I think it's time to see more of this in the sim racing space. Heck, even Gran Turismo's B-Spec mode helped add gameplay variety by having a kinda light team management mechanic, which offered a good alternative to grinding. And I think this is a feature that could have been expanded on and brought to other games and tweaked into a cool modern B-Spec team manager feature, instead of just something that was abandoned after kinda going in the wrong direction in GT6. And this is probably a good place to say that Gran Turismo 4, as a whole, may be my favorite sim racing career, and it may have been amazing for the time, but I think we've just left all this potential on the table, and instead of progressing this campaign style over the last 2 decades, sim racing games have instead taken a different path. So with our big 3 topics covered, I want to talk about why I don't think the Gran Turismo model works anymore. See, back in the early 2000s, the single-player experience was the main experience because a lot of people didn't have very good internet or even consoles that could hook up to the internet at all. Console games having online functionality was a bonus, not the standard. Back when I played GT4 on my PS2, I didn't have a network expansion card, which meant I only experienced games in single player, or rarely through local split screen, which was much better supported at the time. Game studios had to make the single player content good because that's what people were spending their time playing. In the current space though, online PvP dominates gaming. This obviously expands far outside of just racing, where most popular games these days are online experiences. And I think you can draw a lot of parallels to the FPS genre again, where, for example, older Call of Duty games used to be much more about the campaign, but now PvP has really taken over the majority of the experience. And I'm not saying that's really a bad thing. Competing against real players can often be much more fun. You don't need to build as much variety into online games because the other players are that variety. If you look at MOBAs or Battle Royale games, they pretty often only have one main map. But it doesn't get boring because the focus is on the player versus player gameplay and how drastically that can change from match to match. Racing games are similar, where 2 races on the same track can be completely different experiences when you introduce online multiplayer. Real competition is also a powerful motivator. It's often a much greater reward to beat a real person than it is to just beat the computer, and that feeling and drive to improve keeps people coming back. It's retention, and boy do game studios love retention. So, the industry leaning towards a multiplayer focus is natural. Many players want a good online mode to continue playing the game for long periods of time with their friends. And I think it's probably easier for a studio to develop a good framework to let the players create content than it is to continue pumping out unique single-player experiences over a long period of time. So, the sim racing single-player career has taken a back seat, and although the online-only focus can work for some games that are very competitively driven, like iRacing, I think this is ultimately a mistake for the more casual sim-light genre, and for what it's worth, even more arcade racing games that have taken a similar path. I believe that single-player sim racing careers are worth investing in. And in my dream alternate universe, Gran Turismo was just the start of the racing life simulator genre. I want to be able to make important, meaningful decisions on a car purchase and have cars that are important and meaningful to me. I want a campaign that transitions from amateur weekend track day driver to semi-pro, where I'm managing sponsorship deals and building a multi-car roster to compete in more events, and then finally making the transition to go full pro and maybe join a team. Then build funding to start my own team where I can dominate a major World Series or whatever else. And I want an endgame that makes it feel like I've come a long way and really made it to the top of the racing world by earning my way there. Now, none of this is to say that games like iRacing or AC or whatever are bad games for not having a real career mode, or that F1 or WRC games are bad because they have a much more narrow focus. They do their thing well, and I respect that. But I feel like Gran Turismo 4 marked the pinnacle of a subgenre of sim racing careers that's dying out. The single-player sim experience that GT4 represents so well is fading away. Sure, we still see some arcade games focusing on the car lifestyle in a different way, but I still think there's a market for a game that focuses on the racing lifestyle. I think it could even be possible to have a sort of hybrid sim racing career that blends single-player and PvP with something like an iRacing style multiplayer, but surrounded with a lot of the single-player elements of something like Gran Turismo. There's a lot of potential out there to create new and unique sim racing experiences, and I'm just hoping that a studio out there can realize that and run with it. And with that, thank you everyone for listening to this old man ramble on about the good old days for 20-some minutes. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, I really want to hear your thoughts on all of this. The discussion in the comments is always what makes these videos so interesting for me. So let me know where you agree or disagree and what your own thoughts are for a perfect sim racing career. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.